Imagine a person living a life where nothing, neither rudeness, lies, nor disrespect, can shake their peace. They move through the chaos of the world with a calm so profound that others wonder if they know something hidden. They hear the insults, they witness the drama, yet none of it penetrates their inner system. It may touch them, but it does not move them. Yet, in reality, how often do people let a careless comment ruin their entire day? How many nights are spent staring at the ceiling, replaying arguments, reliving anger long after the moment has passed? Most do not live in peace. They live in reaction. They do not own their emotions. Their emotions own them. One insult, one rejection, or one unexpected glance can shift their entire energy, not because the world wields such power, but because they have never learned how to reclaim it. Stoicism, taught centuries ago and now confirmed by neuroscience, shows that anyone can become emotionally untouchable, not cold, not numb, but steady like a mountain in a storm. The wind may howl, the rain crash, yet the mountain remains unmoved. This inner strength allows a person to remain unshaken by what others say, to avoid feeling small due to someone else's mood, and to be free from anger or disturbance. This is emotional sovereignty, the real Stoic power Marcus Aurelius wrote about, not as a display of wisdom, but as a survival tool to bear the weight of an empire without losing oneself. This journey begins with a shift in perception. It is never truly them. It is not the careless words, the disrespectful tone, or the dismissive glance that causes suffering. What stings is what those moments awaken within. Carl Jung's words resonate here. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Every time one blames another for their feelings, they hand over the keys to their emotional state, wondering why chaos always follows. No one can make a person feel anything without their participation. Anger, frustration, resentment, these arise not from others, but from one's response to them, shaped by unresolved parts long avoided. Two individuals may face the same insult. One brushes it off, the other stews in it for days. The insult itself remains unchanged. It is what it encounters inside that matters. Old wounds, unmet expectations, unquestioned beliefs, they amplify the moment. It is rarely about the incident itself. It is about everything it reflects. When someone feels ignored, invisible, or criticized, the reaction is often a replay of past pains, a defensive identity meticulously constructed over time. Protecting a sense of competence, goodness, or strength is deeply tied to self-perception. Even a minor crack can feel catastrophic. The true battlefield is not the conversation, coworker, partner, or stranger online. It is within. Aristotle's wisdom applies. Knowing oneself is the beginning of all wisdom. True self-knowledge involves understanding the places within that still hurt, seek approval, or expect peace to come from external validation. The breakthrough occurs when a person realizes they are not their reactions, anger, or pain. They are the awareness observing them. As they connect more deeply to this awareness, peace becomes independent of the outside world. This does not mean tolerating disrespect, but rather no longer tying inner calm to external behavior. True freedom is rooted in the self-governance. Most people survive on emotional autopilot, derailed by texts, comments, or looks. Emotional sovereignty begins by refusing to cast others as a villain, and instead acknowledging that something within themselves responded. The questions shift. Instead of asking why someone else behaved poorly, one asks why it elicited such a strong reaction. Plato called the first and best victory the conquest of self. This conquest is not suppression of emotion, but understanding its origins and deciding if it still serves. Pride and ego may urge retaliation or defensiveness, but conscious choice allows for mastery over responses. Emotional control is trained, like a muscle, through discipline and presence. Those who trigger a person the most are often the greatest teachers. They reveal attachments, rawness, and identities dependent on others' treatment for validation. By using these moments as mirrors rather than battlefields, a person evolves rather than reacts. Socrates' insight applies. To move the world, first move oneself. Change begins with observing oneself, recognizing the stories and assumptions that dictate reactions, and seeing the gap between expectation and reality. Accepting people as they are, not as one wishes them to be, anchors peace. When anchored internally, a person does not get offended easily, does not chase validation, and does not rely on others to reflect worth. Life may remain turbulent, but calm persists. Stoicism teaches concern only with what is within one's control, the mind, actions, and beliefs. Everything else is external. Grounded in this principle, nothing can disturb inner steadiness. Criticism, rejection, misunderstanding, they are faced with clarity and strength. Emotional freedom is achieved not by avoiding life, but by confronting it fully. All reactions, anger, defensiveness, overthinking, are learned, conditioned responses, absorbed over time, passed down, like a script inherited without awareness. Until the unconscious is made conscious, one acts it out repeatedly, mistaking it for fate or personality. Awareness allows rewriting the script. By becoming the observer, a person notices, pauses, and asks, which part of me is speaking now? This reflection opens a path to emotional mastery, a life unshaken by the chaos of others, and a steady presence that radiates calm and strength to the world. When someone feels triggered, when a fire ignites within them due to another person's words or actions, it's easy for them to believe that fire is justified. Strong emotion, however, does not always indicate truth. Often, it signals that an old script has been activated. When this pattern repeats across different people and situations, one begins to notice a curious constant. The actors change, but the storyline remains the same. The real issue is rarely the other person. It is what they awaken within. Most people fail to trace their reaction back to its origin. They assume their emotional response is valid simply because it feels intense. Yet intensity does not equal clarity. Beneath many reactions lies fear. Fear of being seen in a certain way. Fear of not being heard. Fear of inadequacy. The script tells them that criticism must be met with defense. Yet what if they didn't react? What if they simply listened, filtered, and chose a response rooted not in fear, but in presence? That is true authorship of one's life, taking the pen back. It does not mean anger, sadness, or discomfort disappears. It means reactions are no longer automatic, but conscious. The space between trigger and response becomes freedom. As Viktor Frankl observed, between stimulus and response lies a space, and in that space resides the power to choose, and within choice lies growth and freedom. Life changes profoundly when one stops reacting according to old scripts. When interrupted, a person might observe, breathe, and respond calmly or not at all. This is not weakness. It is a recognition that not every moment deserves energy. They no longer perform for those incapable of validating them. This shift is transformational, moving one from being emotionally controlled to emotionally in control. Control is no longer robotic. It is grounded, conscious, and present. Security no longer requires proving oneself, winning, or being right. The scripts that once dominated lose their grip. Approval-seeking softens, and the compulsion to mirror external chaos dissolves. They realize they can remain the calm presence, reminding others of an alternative way to exist. Plato once said the first and greatest victory is to conquer oneself. This is not about domination, but about discipline, self-awareness, and the quiet strength of someone who knows their worth. When old scripts dominate, it is not just emotions that suffer. It is relationships, peace, and potential. Doors are closed, connections damaged, all because reactions were automatic rather than conscious. Taking authorship means no longer being a puppet of past pain. Recognizing the rising heat and choosing to respond from the highest self, even when difficult, creates a life of intentionality. Socrates called the unexamined life unworthy. The examined life, however, is where inner peace and sovereignty emerge. When a person pauses before reacting, observing their rising emotions instead of surrendering to them, they begin to reclaim their power. Every surge of offense is understood not as an attack, but as a reflection of a script being replayed. People are often triggered not by others' intentions, but by their own unresolved wounds. Carl Jung warned that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will direct life. Recognizing this, one sees that offense is not objective. It is a mirror revealing fragile, unhealed parts of self. Real work lies in strengthening the inner world, rather than silencing the external. True emotional power does not arise from reaction, but from restraint and discernment. Offense is not reality, it is interpretation. When someone insults or disrespects, the danger is not the words themselves, but conclusions the mind draws. Believing one is devalued because of another's words is where real damage occurs. Understanding that others' behavior reflects their own pain allows a person to absorb less and respond with clarity, not compulsion. Socrates taught that people are not angry at others. They are angry at themselves. A calm, grounded presence can trigger others precisely because it mirrors unresolved aspects of their own inner world. Yet it is not one's responsibility to fix them. Those who cultivate this awareness stop flinching, stop being baited, and cease chasing validation or closure from others. They choose peace over performance. Their presence becomes medicine, allowing others to slow down and reflect, inspiring a subtler transformation around them. Triggers are understood as opportunities to pause, breathe, and reclaim the pen. Every conscious response diminishes the puppet-like automaticity of old reactions and strengthens the power of choice. True freedom, then, is not in controlling others, but in governing one's own inner world. Even when insults sting or moments feel personal, the deeper truth is that offense is an invitation to examine oneself. The fire ignited by others reflects the edges of ego, cracks in confidence, and unresolved self-beliefs. By addressing these, a person ceases to be controlled by external chaos, walks into spaces whole, and interacts without needing to be provoked to assert their worth. In reclaiming this power, calm becomes permanent, self-directed, and sovereign. The reactive patterns of old scripts are replaced by conscious choice, allowing life to be navigated not by fear or habit, but by clarity, values, and deliberate presence. They learn that it was not their responsibility to internalize the pain of others. When people around them bled through anger, fear, or dysfunction, surrendering to it meant becoming a reflection of wounds that were not their own. Reacting rather than responding mirrored the chaos, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, one could become part of the cycle of pain. Yet there was another path, one where retaliation was unnecessary, where shrinking away was optional, and where standing firmly in one's own strength was enough to see the suffering for what it was, not theirs. This was not indifference, but mastery, a stillness born from the realization that self-worth does not rise or fall with someone else's mood. They remembered the wisdom of Plato, who wrote that every person carries a hidden battle. Not everyone deserved their energy, but most carried invisible burdens. Old betrayals, deep fears, relentless inner voices. And when these pressures erupted, they often fell on the wrong person. This recognition did not justify mistreatment, but it allowed them to distinguish truth from projection. They honored their own boundaries without letting insults redefine their identity. They let the behavior pass, not out of weakness, but from a strength rooted in self-sufficiency, unshaken by external validation. Over time, patterns became clear. They observed how pain triggered anger, how insecurity disguised itself as coldness, how silence often the fear of rejection. Behaviors that once confused or wounded became easier to interpret. They no longer asked, "What's wrong with me?" but began to understand what remained unresolved in others. The shift was subtle but profound. It turned hours of self-doubt into time spent restoring inner peace, transforming reactive anger into calm clarity, and preventing others' wounds from seeping into their own life. Yet it was not easy. Words that cut deep, especially from loved ones or trusted allies, could shake them, and it was natural to feel shaken. But awareness was key. They recognized the pain as belonging to others, not themselves. Internalizing it only made it part of their identity, carrying it into future interactions, reshaping self-perception through wounds that never belonged to them. They remembered Aristotle's words, "Excellence is a habit, and so is peace, presence, and emotional freedom." It was not a one-time epiphany, but a daily choice. To center themselves, to witness pain without absorbing it. When confronted with sharpness, they paused, breathed, and reminded themselves, This was someone else's storm, not theirs. No fixing, no understanding required, just the awareness that it was not a reflection of themselves. That awareness offered a rare power, the ability to break the cycle, to feel what happened without letting it redefine their inner life. When the world grew loud, when comments cut, when others projected their insecurities, they stayed rooted, not defensive, not dismissive, just steady. The deepest emotional pain rarely came from actions, but from unmet expectations. Contracts they had signed silently in their own minds, assuming fairness, love, and respect in return for kindness, honesty, or effort. And when reality failed to meet these assumptions, it felt like betrayal. But it was simply life being human and people being themselves. By examining these internal patterns, they realized that most suffering was self-authored, built through invisible contracts with friends, partners, family, and even strangers. Life was not a vending machine. Kindness did not guarantee appreciation. Effort did not guarantee fairness. Hurt came not from others' actions, but from the expectations placed upon them. Understanding this shifted perspective. Growth came from releasing silent contracts and letting go of control over outcomes. They embraced the wisdom of Carl Jung. Everything that irritated in others offered a mirror to themselves. They learned to ask why expectations existed, whether they were fair, and to differentiate between values and unspoken demands. Gratitude replaced frustration, and freedom replaced reaction. By acting from values rather than leverage, they engaged with the world from love, not expectation. Slowly, they unlearned the masks of performance, overcompensation, and calculated behavior, the survival mechanisms that had once protected them but had eventually become their identity. Living in alignment with truth rather than image, they discovered presence, steadiness, and clarity. Peace no longer depended on others' recognition, and emotional freedom arose from self-awareness and choice. Ultimately, they understood that identity built on defense, on performance, on proving worth, was fragile. True strength emerged from honesty with oneself, from letting go of the invisible contracts and the rigid masks. They moved through life guided by values, not resentment, aware, not reactive, present, not defensive. They no longer needed applause, defense, or approval, only the truth of their own steady, unfolding self. That is where the suffering begins, for pretending is a form of betrayal, subtle, soft, yet betrayal nonetheless. Every time one silences their own truth to be accepted, a fragment of their soul bears a cost. Every forced laugh at a painful moment, every downplayed need, every act of appearing unaffected while falling apart, widens the gap between who they are and the persona they present. Socrates once said that knowing oneself is the beginning of wisdom, yet true self-knowledge demands facing the hidden parts, not only from others but from oneself. It requires asking difficult questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I truly believe when I stop trying to please? What do I genuinely want beyond what is expected? The answers may shake the carefully constructed persona, but on the other side lies something infinitely more authentic and peaceful. When the mask burns away, one stops negotiating for belonging, stops earning worth through performance, and ceases fearing misunderstanding, because they finally understand themselves. Aristotle noted that happiness belongs to the self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency is more than material independence. It is emotional sovereignty, the ability to show up fully, unapologetically, and let the world respond as it will. Some will draw closer, some will walk away, but either way, they are seen not for their role or reputation, but for the soul beneath. There exists a quiet freedom in shedding the mask, subtle, steady, express an honest speech even when the voice trembles, in choosing peace over perfection, and in no longer needing to prove one's value in every room. Growth no longer comes from pressure but from truth. One develops not to become worthy, but because they already are. The pursuit of wholeness shifts from chasing it to returning to it. Others will feel the difference. Presence becomes magnetic, not through impressiveness, but authenticity. There's a quiet strength in it, a peace that requires no explanation. Though the world may not always reward it, the soul will. Carl Jung reminded that the most terrifying task is to accept oneself completely. Yet those who confront their fears, flaws, and desires without turning away no longer need a mask. They are no longer hiding from themselves. Most people walk through life hoping for smooth, predictable days, wishing for peace or delaying engagement until they feel ready. Life does not wait. Chaos arrives uninvited. The difference lies in how one responds, emotionally reactive or emotionally prepared. Resilience is built not in calm, but in anticipation, through a practice the Stoics call premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. It is the mental rehearsal of what could go wrong, not to create fear, but to train the mind to respond with calm when impact comes. Many fail to do this, living with unspoken assumptions of smoothness, only to collapse when the unexpected strikes. Mental preparation transforms surprise into readiness. A person who visualizes challenges, disappointments, triggers, provocations, walks through them mentally, practicing calm, grounding, and presence. The mind grows resilient, like muscle, strengthened through resistance. The Stoics did not dwell in pessimism. They knew the best way to remain calm was to expect the heat and rehearse staying cool. Aristotle emphasized that virtues are cultivated through action, just by acting justly, temperately, and bravely. Mental rehearsal allows the brain to distinguish less between imagination and reality. Athletes, performers, soldiers, and surgeons employ it. So why not anyone who seeks mastery over their inner life? When rehearsed, moment of frustration, interruptions, criticism, disappointments no longer control the individual. They pause, breathe, and let the moment pass without surrendering to it. Carl Jung emphasized that until the unconscious is made conscious, it directs life, often under the guise of fate. Mental preparation illuminates triggers and patterns before they overwhelm. It is not paranoia but preparedness. Life is designed with discomfort, imperfection, and unpredictability. Suffering often arises not from events themselves, but from being blindsided by them. Expectations are fragile towers of invisible glass. When reality shifts, people change, plans fail, life deviates. The collapse feels like betrayal. Jung observed that resistance prolongs suffering. Acceptance, preparedness, and flexible internal structures cushion the impact. Stoics would wait to ask, who might upset me today? What hardship could I face? Not from pessimism, but from understanding inevitability and choosing to avoid shock. Disappointment and anger often arise not from external events, but from unmet expectations and fragile ego defenses. Aristotle noted that anyone can be angry. It is easy, but true mastery of anger requires precision, timing, and purpose. Most act from reflex, letting emotions spill onto themselves and others. Yet reflection can interrupt the ego's grip. Pause and ask, what in me feels threatened? Softens edges, shrinks the ego, and allows conscious choice over reaction. Anger need not destroy. It can be observed, contained, and transformed. Silence, reflection, and awareness create strength. Power is not always loud. True power is calm, grounded, and unshakable. Presence becomes magnetic because it is authentic, not performative. Rehearsal, reflection, and mindful awareness cultivate the ability to respond rather than react. The prepared mind faces life with clarity. Surprise fades, shock softens, and what remains is a capacity to act from understanding rather than fear. Pain cannot be eliminated, but unnecessary suffering can. Confusion, disbelief, and spiraling diminish when one separates reality from expectation. Plato asserted that reality is shaped by the mind. By accepting life as it comes rather than clinging to imagined smoothness, peace grows. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to practice response, to breathe, and to reclaim power. The sacred pause, breathing and observing before reacting, reveals wounds, triggers, values, and the threshold between clarity and fear. In a culture that idolizes speed, instant opinion, and reaction, wisdom thrives in stillness. The individual who masters pause and awareness is not emotionless but conscious. Through reflection over reaction, through rehearsing and embodying truth, one becomes less controlled by pride and more anchored in essence. True freedom emerges, calm, grounded, and strong, radiating stability, not through dominance, but through quiet mastery. The Those with the most compelling arguments are often the ones who can remain silent, resisting the urge to fill every pause. Aristotle once said that knowing oneself is the beginning of all wisdom, yet self-knowledge rarely emerges amidst emotional chaos. It arrives in stillness, in the pause, in the conscious decision not to lash out. When a person experiences their emotions fully without reacting impulsively, they gain access to discernment, a rare ability to distinguish pain from truth, urgency from importance, and what must be said from what is better left unspoken. Sometimes the most powerful act is to refrain from defending oneself, not a surrender, but as a demonstration of independence from a need to prove anything. A person who has outgrown reactionary behavior chooses peace over being right, alignment over volume. Socrates reminded that living with honor requires being who we pretend to be. Most pretend to be strong, but true strength lies not in dominance, but in discipline. The ability to regulate one's energy, to witness chaos without becoming it, to remain grounded even when emotions demand expression. This does not imply suppressing feelings. It means experiencing them fully. By resisting the urge to react, a person begins to hear the true messages behind their emotions. Anger protecting vulnerability, sadness revealing longing, anxiety pointing to the desire for control. They sit with these feelings without judgment, cultivating emotional sovereignty, the capacity to respond from awareness rather than conditioned impulses. The pause strengthens over time, retraining the nervous system and creating a calmer, more resilient self, able to weather life's storms not because they no longer hurt, but because one is no longer swept away by each wave. Plato observed that wise individuals speak when they have something to say. Fools speak because they feel compelled to. The sacred pause allows a person to determine which path they are choosing. If they wait long enough and let emotions flow completely, urgency softens, perceived injustices diminish, and apparent emergencies often reveal themselves as mere tests of presence. Saying nothing does not equate to doing nothing. It is a conscious choice of what comes next, rather than letting emotion dictate action. This is the essence of freedom, separating those who are owned by their reactions from those who master their responses. When discomfort arises, it may not originate externally. The irritation one experiences is often a mirror reflecting unresolved internal wounds. Carl Jung noted that everything that irritates us about others can reveal something about ourselves. Flared anger, chest tightness, or sudden heat in the eyes serve as signals toward unhealed parts of self. By observing these signals, one realizes that the conflict is with internal narratives, the stories telling them they must be like to be worthy, right to be respected, or chosen feel complete. These stories sit quietly until triggered by everyday interactions. The pain is rarely caused solely by external behavior. It is the echo of internal wounds amplified by circumstance. The person who pauses, observes, and asks what internal beliefs are activated begins to reclaim agency. They notice patterns, respond to the root of their pain rather than the behavior of others, and begin the process of healing. Realizing that the mirror lies within, they stop demanding perfection from the external world, no longer seeking constant validation, agreement, or reassurance. Stability emerges from self-awareness rather than others' actions, fostering resilience, groundedness, and presence. People notice not because they are told, but because the absence of reaction signals mastery over self, not over others. When facing disrespect, impulsive reactions are natural. Snapping back, mirroring energy, or striking verbally to assert oneself. Yet the strongest counterpunch is often compassion, not sentimental pity, but clear-seeing compassion that discerns the pain behind behavior. Recognizing that cruelty frequently stems from suffering rather than power allows one to perceive wounds instead of enemies. Observation creates space, and space allows the exercise of choice, to respond with awareness rather than impulsively. Compassion becomes the ultimate countermeasure, giving mastery over one's own voice, energy, and narrative. When confronted with provocations, the person in observer mode studies the scene without absorbing it. They watch posture, tone, and facial expressions, considering what others might carry, all while remaining still. Presence emerges not as avoidance, but as leadership, a deliberate choice of awareness over reactivity. By stepping back, they no longer react automatically, but analyze the tension, learn from it, and regain control, the ability to withhold, to allow moments to breathe, and to observe rather than intervene demonstrates true power. This practice begins small, noticing tension, imagining oneself as a detached observer, and tracking internal responses. Over time, clarity deepens, pauses lengthen, and reactions soften. Emotional thoughts are entertained without automatic enactment, cultivating growth without force. By trusting this cultivated grounding, one no longer needs the world to act a certain way to feel whole. Peace arises not from being understood or validated, but from mastery of presence. Ultimately, the person who embraces this path practices self-sovereignty, choosing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act, and when to observe. They meet the pain of others without adding to it, interrupting destructive cycles and fostering understanding. They move through the world with composure, aware that their true power lies not in reaction, but in disciplined response, in compassion that allows them to rise above provocation while remaining fully human. It comes from understanding oneself deeply enough to know that approval from others isn't necessary. Everyone has experienced moments when someone misrepresents them, framing the story to make themselves look right and casting them as wrong. Instantly, the mind begins constructing a case, collecting evidence, rehearsing defenses, but all of this arises from the same wound, the belief that one's worth depends on another's version of reality. It doesn't. Aristotle once said it is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it. The same applies to criticism, assumptions, or opinions thrown one's way, even when they completely miss the point. A person can hear them, consider them briefly, and choose not to accept them, not out of fear of conflict, but because they have reached a level of inner clarity where not everything demands a response. Letting someone be wrong about them is not weakness. It is strength in its most silent form. It declares, "I know who I am, and I do not need your agreement to feel real." This does not mean that they never speak up. It means choosing when to speak with purpose, not pride. They stop responding to bait, stop explaining themselves to those committed to misunderstanding, stop pleading for fairness in conversations that were never about truth. Socrates taught that strong minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and weak minds discuss people. When a person engages in endless correction and defense, they often fall into the last category, discussing themselves and others in ways that lead nowhere. But when they rise above the need to be right, they enter a quieter, clearer, higher place. From there, something remarkable happens. The world becomes lighter. They realize that not everyone needs to like them, that not every story needs correcting, and that sometimes the most powerful action is to nod, say nothing, and keep walking, not out of indifference, but out of discipline, because they understand the cost of peace and refuse to trade it for the illusion of control. Others may judge them as arrogant or assume they are wrong. Still, they need not carry those distortions forward. Plato observed that opinion lies between knowledge and ignorance, and most opinions about a person are exactly that, filtered through pain, projection, and limited perspective. One need not argue with opinions. Living truthfully and freely becomes the ultimate response. Through consistent practice, insults and criticisms lose their power, not because a person becomes numb, but because they become awake. Awake to who they are, awake to what is real, and awake to the fact that their energy is too valuable to spend reacting to things that do not belong to them. They visualize words and barbs floating past like harmless paper birds, landing softly behind them, powerless, unnoticed. This skill takes time, because most people instinctively catch insults, grip them, and carry them indefinitely. Only by refusing to catch these emotional projectiles does a person cultivate unshakable inner peace. Carl Jung said that until one makes the unconscious conscious, it directs life, and one calls it fate. Every reaction, every moment of anger or irritation, reveals parts of self that remain unhealed. By observing these triggers without feeding them, a person begins to retrain their emotional reflexes, building endurance and clarity where panic or impulse once ruled. Each moment of frustration, every minor offense or delay, becomes a rep in an emotional gym, a chance to strengthen awareness, patience, and control. Emotional mastery is not the absence of triggers, but the conscious use of them as training partners. A person learns to face discomfort rather than avoid it, to remain grounded amid provocations, to examine envy, sadness, or irritation for lessons about unmet desires or unresolved wounds. Aristotle observed that excellence is habit. By repeatedly practicing calm, discernment, and intentional response, emotional excellence is cultivated. Over time, the space between stimulus and response expands, and when it comes to power to choose actions aligned with values rather than reactions dictated by old patterns, true strength emerges quietly. It manifests in moments when a person feels the urge to lash out but chooses restraint, when pain is present but not weaponized, when anger rises but does not dominate. This kind of silence is sacred. It allows speech to emerge from clarity rather than chaos, from wisdom rather than wounding. Words, once spoken from this place, land deeper, connect rather than hurt, and convey understanding rather than raw emotion. Ultimately, this person learns that they are not their emotions. Emotions may surge, fear may flood, and shame may press, but none of it defines them unless they allow it. By refusing to become the storm, by walking through life with discipline and awareness, they cultivate a grounded presence that others cannot disturb. In this way, peace becomes a choice, a practice, a daily demonstration of strength far more powerful than any outburst or defense. The observer watched the emotions rise, understanding that the difference between being the feeling and witnessing it was a line between chaos and clarity, between being tossed around by every thought and standing still in the heart of the storm. As Carl Jung once noted, until the unconscious is brought into awareness, it directs life, and people call it fate. Emotions were part of that unconscious current, surging unpredictably, and without practice and awareness, they could take control. One's voice, posture, and choices risked being puppeteered by raw feelings rather than guided by wisdom. But feelings were not facts. They were visitors, arriving, speaking, leaving. Those who learned to pause, even for a breath, create a space between themselves and the emotion. In that space, they reclaimed their role, remembering that they were not anger, not fear, not the ego crying out for defense. They were the observer, capable of choosing not to react. Socrates' call to know thyself could only be answered through this separation, stepping back, not to disconnect, but to notice the story emotions told without blind belief. When anger arose, urgent and demanding action, the practiced observer waited. In those seconds of stillness, the anger revealed itself as energy, a defense mechanism from a threatened part of the self. When not obeyed immediately, it lost its power. It was felt but no longer controlling. Fear, too, revealed itself as whispers of potential disasters, tightening the chest and racing the mind. Yet even fear weakened when observed. Naming it brought presence, and the watcher remained calm, knowing that no emotion lasted forever. Feelings were like clouds passing through the sky of awareness, and the observer was the sky, not the clouds. Aristotle had said that anyone could become angry, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree at the right time, required disidentification. This ability, to feel anger yet not become it, granted choice. Choice transformed reaction into response. One stopped being a puppet of circumstance and began guiding behavior with intention. Emotions were not suppressed or denied. They were fully experienced but allowed to pass without forming identity. Like a fire alarm, emotions sounded loud and urgent, impossible to ignore, but one investigated rather than smashed. Curiosity replaced compliance, and every moment of observation strengthened the self, creating steadiness and freedom. People around them felt the difference. They were no longer easily rattled or provoked, not because they didn't feel, but because feelings no longer defined them. Plato wrote that the first and best victory is to conquer oneself, and the observer conquered not with force, but with awareness, noticing the precise moment emotion tried to take the wheel and choosing to remain centered instead. This work was not easy. It required practice, patience, and discipline. Yet with each act of disidentification came closer steps toward emotional sovereignty, a state where external chaos no longer dictated peace. The world did not quiet for the observer. People still cut them off mid-sentence, misread intentions, failed to apologize, and chose ego over honesty. Life still threw late nights, early calls, broken trust, sudden loss. But mastery meant these events no longer shook them, because the goal had never been to change the world. It was to change how they moved through it. Most people lived in constant emotional turbulence, bouncing between triggers like pinballs, believing the world needed to be different for them to feel okay. They tried to control everything outside themselves, clinging to agreement, avoiding discomfort, chasing control. But the observer learned to stand still inside the waves, knowing, as Jung said, that I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. They became untouchable, not because life no longer struck, but because it no longer owned them. They did not match the moods of the room, or swing from high to low based on others' words. They stayed centered and quiet, their calm cultivated through watching, detaching, and disidentifying. The observer lived not as a reactor, but as a responder. Reacting was fast, defensive, emotional, driven by fear, pride, or unexamined pain. Responding was deliberate, conscious, arising from presence rather than panic. Once one lived from response, the world appeared different, not because it had changed, but because the observer had. Old insults now sounded like static. Past rejections felt like redirections. There was no longer an urgent need to prove oneself, win arguments, or control outcomes. Apologies were optional for closure, understanding unnecessary from everyone else. That was emotional freedom. Socrates had said that to think for oneself, one must first see oneself, separated from the waves of emotion, the ego's noise, and the storms others carried. Mastery did not mean numbness. The observer still felt betrayal, sarcasm, and loss. They still cared, but they no longer reacted from the wound. They responded from the wisdom forged through it. Quiet confidence showed in the rhythm of their breath, in choosing silence over proving a point, in walking away not from weakness but from clarity. Plato's measure of a person, they understood, was how one wielded power, and the greatest power lay in restraint, discipline, and alignment. Even when everything tried to pull them off balance, they did not chase closure, repeat draining stories, or shrink their peace to fit a room. Instead, they moved forward with clarity, carrying a rare stillness that no insult could shatter, a calm independent of comfort. They had walked straight through chaos and emerged unshaken. When the world pulled at their edges, they remained centered, not by avoiding life, but by mastering their calm.